Salawat. We're now going to start the main program with the recitation of Surah Yasin.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. ياسين والقرآن الحكيم إنك لمن المرسلين على صراط مستقيم تنزيل العزيز الرحيم لتنذر قوما ما أنذر آباؤهم فهم غافلون لقد حق القول على أكثرهم فهم لا يؤمنون إنا جعلنا في أعناقهم أغلالا فهي إلى الأذقان فهم مقمحون وجعلنا من بين أيديهم سدا ومن خلفهم سدا فأغشيناهم فهم لا يبصرون وسواء عليهم أأنذرتهم أم لم تنذرهم لا يؤمنون إنما تنذر من اتبع الذكر وخشي الرحمن بالغيب فبشره بمغفرة وأجر كريم إنا نحن نحيي الموتى ونكتب ما قدموا وآثارهم وكل شيء أحصيناه في إمام مبين واضرب لهم مثلا أصحاب القرية إذ جاءها المرسلون إذ أرسلنا إليهم 2 فكذبوهما فعززنا بثالث فقالوا إنا إليكم مرسلون قالوا ما أنتم إلا بشر مثلنا وما أنزل الرحمن من شيء إن أنتم إلا تكذبون قالوا ربنا يعلم إنا إليكم لمرسلون وما علينا إلا البلاغ المبين قالوا إنا تطيرنا بكم لئن لم تنتهوا لنرجمنكم وليمسنكم منا عذاب أليم قالوا طائركم معكم أئن ذكرتم بل أنتم قوم مسرفون وجاء من أقصى المدينة رجل يسعى قال يا قوم اتبعوا المرسلين اتبعوا من لا يسألكم أجرا وهم مهتدون وما لي لا أعبد الذي فطرني وإليه ترجعون أأتخذ من دونه آلهة إن يردني الرحمن بضر لا تغني عني شفاعتهم شيئا ولا ينقذون إني إذا لفي ضلال مبين إني آمنت بربكم فاسمعون قيل ادخل الجنة قال يا ليت قومي يعلمون بما غفر لي ربي وجعلني من المكرمين وما أنزلنا على قومه من بعده من جند من السماء وما كنا منزلين إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم خامدون يا حسرة على العباد ما يأتيهم من رسول إلا كانوا به يستهزئون ألم يروا كم أهلكنا قبلهم من القرون أنهم إليهم لا يرجعون وإن كل لما جميع لدينا محضرون وآية لهم الأرض الميتة أحييناها وأخرجنا منها حبا فمنه يأكلون وجعلنا فيها جنات من نخيل وعناب وفجرنا فيها من العيون ليأكلوا من ثمره وما عملته أيديهم أفلا يشكرون سبحان الذي خلق الأزواج كلها مما تنبت الأرض ومن أنفسهم ومما لا يعلمون وآية لهم الليل نسلخ منه النهار فإذا هم مظلمون والشمس تجري لمستقر لها ذلك تقدير العزيز العليم والقمر قدرناه منازل حتى عاد كالعرجون القديم لا الشمس ينبغي لها أن تدرك القمر ولا الليل سابق النهار وكل في فلك يسبحون وآية لهم أنا حملنا ذريتهم في الفلك المشحون وخلقنا لهم من مثله ما يركبون وإن نشأ نغرقهم فلا صريخ لهم ولا هم ينقذون إلا رحمة منا ومتاعا إلى حين وإذا قيل لهم اتقوا ما بين أيديكم وما خلفكم لعلكم ترحمون وما تأتيهم من آية من آيات ربهم إلا كانوا عنها معرضين وإذا قيل لهم أنفقوا مما رزقكم الله قال الذين كفروا للذين آمنوا أنطعم من لو يشاء الله أطعمه إن أنتم إلا في ضلال مبين ويقولون متى هذا الوعد إن كنتم صادقين ما ينظرون إلا صيحة واحدة تأخذهم وهم يخصمون فلا يستطيعون توصية ولا إلى أهلهم يرجعون ونفخ في الصور فإذا هم من الأجداث إلى ربهم ينسلون قالوا يا ويلنا من بعثنا من مرقدنا هذا ما وعد الرحمن وصدق المرسلون إن كانت إلا صيحة واحدة فإذا هم جميع لدينا محضرون فاليوم لا تظلم نفس شيئا ولا تجزون إلا ما كنتم تعملون إن أصحاب الجنة اليوم في شغل فاكهون هم وأزواجهم في ظلال على الأرائك متكئون لهم فيها فاكهة ولهم ما يدعون سلام قولا من رب رحيم وامتازوا اليوم أيها المجرمون ألم أعهد إليكم يا بني آدم ألا تعبدوا الشيطان إنه لكم عدو مبين وأن اعبدوني هذا صراط مستقيم ولقد أضل منكم جبلا كثيرا أفلم تكونوا تعقلون هذه جهنم التي كنتم توعدون اصلوها اليوم بما كنتم تكفرون اليوم نختم على أفواههم وتكلمنا أيديهم وتشهد أرجلهم بما كانوا يكسبون ولو نشاء لطمسنا على أعينهم فاستبقوا الصراط فأنا يبصرون ولو نشاء لمسخناهم على مكانتهم فما استطاعوا مضيا ولا يرجعون ومن نعمره ننكس في الخلق أفلا يعقلون وما علمناه الشعر وما ينبغي له إن هو إلا ذكر وقرآن مبين لينذر من كان حيا ويحق القول على الكافرين أولم يروا أنا خلقناه لهم مما عملت أيدينا أنعاما فهم لها مالكون وذللناها لهم فمنها ركوبهم ومنها يأكلون ولهم فيها منافع ومشارب أفلا يشكرون واتخذوا من دون الله آلهة لعلهم ينصرون لا يستطيعون نصرهم وهم لهم جند محضرون فلا يحزنك قولهم إنا نعلم ما يسرون وما يعلنون أولم ير الإنسان أنا خلقناه من نطفة فإذا هو خصيم مبين وضرب لنا مثلا ونسي خلقه قال من يحيي العظام وهي رميم قل يحييها الذي أنشأها أول مرة وهو بكل خلق عليم الذي جعل لكم من الشجر الأخضر نارا فإذا أنتم منه توقدون أوليس الذي خلق السماوات والأرض بقادر على أن يخلق مثلهم بلى وهو الخلاق العليم إنما أمره إذا أراد شيئا أن يقول له كن فيكون فسبحان الذي بيده ملكوت كل شيء وإليه ترجعون. Brothers and sisters, we are requested to recite Surah Fatiha for Marhum Ali Asghar Ali Hassan, who passed away this morning in London. Al-Fatiha.
And now we're very fortunate to have Julian Bond speak to us on the topic of sitting on the fence, a 23-year journey through two religions. Let's welcome him. Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Julian Bond used to head the Christian Muslim Forum and wrote both Jumbled Up in Jerusalem, retelling the story of Jesus, and How to Read the Quran, a guide for those who aren't sure about it. His deep experiences include itikaf in Nottingham, dialogue in the desert with scholars, and sitting at the back of mosques all around England, as well as having over 500 Muslim friends on Facebook. He recently converted to Islam, probably publicly at least a month ago, and we're very fortunate to have him speak on his journey today. Salat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you to Miqdad for the invitation. Thank you. But mainly thank you to my wife, who suggested that it would be appropriate for me to announce my conversion to, well, seemed like the world in the end. Just so people knew. I mean, I was telling people at work, but I hadn't gone mass market with it. So about a month ago, I posted on Facebook that I had converted. I converted at the end of August. I took my Shahada at a meeting of the Threshold Society with Sheikh Kabir Helminski, and was welcomed into the community there. And then after that, I did it officially at Muslim Welfare House in Finsbury Park. My friend Tawfiq Qasimi is the chief executive there. I thought it was appropriate to do it officially and get a certificate, so I know that comes in handy sometimes. And somewhat unexpected. So a little background. I became a Christian in 1978 as a teenager. And I went to university in the 1980s and studied Christian theology. There was a dusty old second-hand bookshop across the road. And I would root around on a Monday, because we didn't have lectures on Monday, because all the trainee ministers had been out preaching, so as to give them time to get back. So every Monday morning I'd be rooting around in this dusty old bookshop run by this very old man, or he seemed very old anyway. And I came across a copy of the Quran in 1985. And I bought it for a couple of pounds. It sat on my bookshelf for 15 years, unread, and I never looked at it. I was commuting into London. I lived in Bedfordshire at the time, and was looking for something to read on the journey in. And I spotted it on the shelf, and I thought, oh, let's read this. So you could say, be careful what you read. So it was Rodwell's translation of the Quran. He was a Victorian vicar. He was the vicar of St Ethelburga's in the City of London, which is now a peace, interfaith, reconciliation centre. Very appropriate. So I read it, and he had the brilliant idea of reordering the surahs so that they were in chronological order, which I know is not the usual way. But then it starts with a massive impact, with the angel saying to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, recite, read. And I read it, and it was very much like the King James version of the Bible, if you've ever come across that. So it was a very English, kind of Victorian Christian experience of Muslim scripture. And he had all these negative footnotes. I think you've read it. But it left me intrigued, so I read the whole thing, cover to cover, from beginning to end, and I know a lot of people don't tend to read the whole thing anyway, let alone in that order, let alone in archaic English, which maybe that's even harder to read than Arabic, who knows. And I was intrigued. I thought, well, what is this religion of Islam all about? I didn't study it in school. I think we had 3 sessions when I was at university doing my Christian theology degree. We did a bit on other religions, but I didn't really have any idea of Islam. So there were bulletin boards on the internet in the early 2000s. This is before Facebook, before Twitter, just as the internet was getting going for normal people. And I began having interfaith arguments with people at that early stage because they were making Islamophobic comments and so on. But that early experience opened up the possibility, my interest in Islam, and I was still working at the Inland Revenue, HMRC, and an email came round just before the Easter holidays. I happened to go back into the office because we were given a half day just before Easter, and there was a secondment opportunity to work for the Archbishop of Canterbury's Christian Muslim Initiative. So underwritten by 10 Downing Street, because Tony Blair was a fan of that. I suppose he still is, but as a more difficult character later than he was at that point. So I was really interested. I thought, I must do this, and I panicked because I was just about to go on leave. It didn't say when the closing date was. Fortunately, it was okay, and I applied for it. I was interviewed, and there were some well-known community figures on the interview panel, the late Fuad Nadi, the late John Austin, Bishop of Aston, who was the lead bishop on the Archbishop's Initiative. I think the later Ataullah Siddiqui might have been there also. So I got the job. I was transferred for 2 years to the Archbishop of Canterbury's office. And that was when it all began. That was when it all kicked off. And so it was Carey at the time. So it was Archbishop Carey's initiative because he'd done national service in the Middle East, and he had a good experience of Islam and the Muslim communities. And he saw the growing Muslim community in this country, and some of this was sort of post-Rushdie. Maybe a lot of it was post-Rushdie. And he wanted to do something. He wanted to create peace between Christians and Muslims, and for us to work together nationally, constructively, harmoniously, for the good of society, and to spread that message with the whole of society. Just before I started that role, it didn't really seem like work some of the time, I read the Quran again. This time it was Dawood's translation. He was an Iranian Jew, So another off-piece translation, I guess. And another interesting read, and it's a different flavour. And I read it because I thought, okay, this is all about engaging with the Muslim community all around England in places where there are large concentrations of Muslims, meeting lots of Muslims, having various conversations. Surely we're going to talk about the Quran. Actually, we didn't very much. I was surprised. But I was topping up my tank, if you like. But what did happen is I kept reading it, but now against a heightened background of tuning into negativity towards Muslims and Islam and Muslim community. And unfortunately, sadly, negative messages within the Christian community, which were anti-Islam. And I was reading the Quran again. I was reading the first 9 chapters, the longest ones, the big chunk of the Quran, and I could see that there were all these pointers which were really challenging the anti-Islam, anti-Muslim narrative. At the same time, people were saying, well, you're gullible, you've been influenced, and all the rest of it. And I met an imam at one of the London universities, as a chaplain. And we sat and read the Quran together, and he read the Arabic, he translated some of it for me. We reflected together on the text and how the message is about peace, and he was an interesting character. He would go to interfaith meetings and tell people that he used to be Taliban, because he went to the Deoband seminary, and so that always made an impact. And he said, if you read scripture, it makes you liberal, meaning open, generous, inclusive, welcoming, etc., etc. And he really wants to challenge everyone who didn't see it in that way. Everyone who was hardline, everyone who was strict, I guess. And he was working to debrief people who'd been involved in Al-Muhajirun and other organizations, and seemed to be doing a good job of it. But I think he actually went too far in that direction, and he started suggesting that some of my colleagues were on the extreme end of things, which I didn't think they were, but you know how it goes. Sometimes it's hard to shake off the extremism, even if you move across the spectrum. So I'd say I had a deep experience in those 2 years. I did go to lots and lots of mosques all around the country, sitting in the back, reflecting, praying, wondering what was going on, because I still know only that much Arabic. And really, really reflecting on it. And then the work was complete. We wrote the report, gave it to the Archbishop of Canterbury, proposed the creation of the Christian Muslim Forum, asked him to be the patron, which he agreed to, and then I went back to my job at the Inland Revenue, and I was restless and distracted, and I really wanted to get back to interfaith. And then the Christian Muslim Forum was getting ready to launch, and it said, we want to appoint a director. So I applied for that job like a shot. I remember being interviewed by a group of very familiar people, because I'd worked with them for 2 years by that point, and I turned up at the interview with a bandaged hand because I'd had an accident with a hot water bottle, being very careless, and I had to go to A&E. But there I was with my bandaged hand, and I got that job also. And I remember Fuad Nadi saying, now the real work starts. And again, or continuing, I made that same intention to explore Islam and engage with the Muslim community as deeply as possible. Not being safe about it, not being cautious, just going for it. And talk about putting your toe in the water. I waded right in. And that first year I was working at the forum, and I could tell you a lot about the forum, but I mean, it's out there. And my friend and colleague, Dr. Musharraf Hussain, an imam in Nottingham, he told me that he would be unavailable for 10 days. We were working together on planning events. We used to do leaders events. We started by calling them imams and ministers, and we realized that didn't quite work, especially because not many women were coming to these events, so we had to tweak it. So he said he'd be on retreat in the mosque for 10 days. So I said to him, oh, that sounds very interesting. I'd be up for doing that. So he said, well, why don't you come next year? So in 2007, I think it was November then for Ramadan, I went there for a really, really deep experience of Islam in the Muslim community. And obviously, I was the only Christian in the masjid. Just as they were reciting the last sixth of the Quran. So that's from about Surah 49, I think, with guest reciters, and I'd taken my translation. I think it was Dawood again. And I was sitting not right at the back, but near the back, reading my translation as it was being recited, keeping up with what was being recited. And I think actually not many people there actually spoke or could translate the Arabic. So there was a small group of young guys sitting around me, looking over my shoulder so they could see the translation. So that was a slightly mind-boggling experience and was a good experience. And it came out of a time of difficulty and tension, because I shared my intention to do this with my colleagues at the Christian Muslim Forum. And for whatever reason, I tried to describe aspects of Islam, comparing them to different strands within Christianity. So some aspects of Islam are like evangelical Christianity. Some of it, the masjid, is like independent churches and so on. And this actually upset quite a few colleagues. And I'd recently read Ray Gaston's book. He's a parish priest up in Leeds. Book's called A Heart Broken Open. He got there before me and got in really deep with the Muslim community, and he'd been joining the prayers during Ramadan. He hadn't converted, and he'd done his own prayers, but he'd been there. He'd done all the fasting. He turned up for all the prayers, and he'd had this really deep experience of the spirituality of Islam. And so I said, well, I could join the rows in the prayers, and I received a fatwa, if you like. Do not join the rows. You're there officially, professionally as a Christian. You cannot join in this. So I sat at the back and I kept out of it, and it was difficult because I had to promise my boss that I wasn't going to join in and that I was going to keep to the boundaries. So in many areas we do need to keep boundaries. We all know about boundaries, but I wasn't bothered about these particular boundaries. But he said people need to know that you're a Christian in this organisation, and that you're not a hybrid, etc., etc. I think they were too late by that point anyway. But so out of that difficulty, one morning after Fajr, I started writing reflections. The other difficult thing was them saying, do not share your reflections with us and do not publish them. So as soon as I finished working at the Christian Muslim Forum, I published them on the internet. But that was a really deep, transforming, heart-changing experience. And I told people about it in interfaith events, although Musharraf would say, well, don't go overboard with it. Just be cool. While all this was going on, I was also running a church Bible study group. You may have heard of the Alpha course. Yeah, its publicity is everywhere. We did it in my church, and I had a difficult experience because I had a small disagreement with one of the leaders. And there are a number of other people in the church, mostly older people, but not completely, who found the material not what they were looking for, didn't suit them. So a group of us got together and said, well, what could we do? What can we do differently? How can we not get together and look at a book with lots of answers in it, but ask lots and lots of questions? And someone else had got there first, Bishop David Jenkins in the mid-1980s. There was a lot of outroar in the Church of England about him at the time. He'd written the book called... I can't remember what it's now. I can't remember the title now. But, Free to Believe. So we called our group Free to Believe because we were going to go and ask lots of questions, difficult questions, awkward questions. And we thought we'd invented interfaith during this. I had a Buddhist monk come and talk to us about Buddhism. And we had a local imam come and do 2 sessions with us, the first time he wants to convert us all. And he said some slightly rude things about the Trinity, but he calmed down the second time. We let him back, and we had another conversation with him. So we weren't particularly observing the boundaries, we weren't being terribly well-behaved, and it opened up a lot of creativity and imagination and thinking through things through differently. And I started reflecting on, for a number of reasons, the person of Jesus. So Jesus is central to Christianity, also an important figure in Islam. But a lot of what's said about him in Christianity is about the theology, the belief, the creed, not so much about him as a person. One of the things that I'd encountered in Islam is the reverence for the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the interest in telling stories from his life, the hadith, the sunnah. And I started asking myself, and maybe other people, why aren't we telling each other stories of Jesus? Why aren't we thinking about Jesus as a person? Yes, we believe particular things about him, but why are we not thinking about him as a person? And just like people want to emulate the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, why are we not looking at emulating Jesus? What kind of man was he? And it does give you some idea in the gospel. It doesn't have as much content as the sunnah, as the hadith. And yes, so Miqdad mentioned jumbled up in Jerusalem. So I got, as well as getting into Islam, I got deeper and deeper into rethinking everything and retelling the story. Because what occurred to me is that the story that was told 2,000 years ago was fresh and they were speaking their own language, and then it doesn't speak to the present day in the same way, and people have in a post-Christian society, people are not really there. So So I started retelling the story. This is part of my journey. This engages with all those Muslim reflections. At the other end of the country, in the north, the stranger reappears. He was a northerner, but no one knew who he was, where he came from, or what was special about him until they met him. His name was Jesus. He had olive skin, was mid-height with dark hair, a warm smile, except when callousness and inhumanity made him really angry, and a twinkle in his eyes. Oh, and a beard. He looked like a Muslim, or vice versa. He started preaching in the northern towns. He was difficult and controversial. If you've ever wanted to be a radical, then he is a role model for you, an inspiration for prophetic figures like Martin Luther King, Gandhi, even Muhammad. And he told his followers, so this is a retranslation, wherever you go, stay with the people who have resources. When you arrive, say shalom or salam. If they're in tune with God, they'll enjoy peace. If not, then it's still with you. And he got in trouble. If it wasn't the crowds, it was the religious police. The ultra-religious came with their questions. They put him on the spot by asking for a sign from heaven. The Prophet Muhammad had the same problem. He was very irritated. Everyone wants a sign. There isn't one. So my journey was bringing Christianity and Islam together. So I would preach and I'd mention Islamic references, invite Muslim friends, not to convert them, but because we're all together. And if it was Ramadan and I was leading worship, make sure that we were praying for the community as people were celebrating or observing Ramadan. How am I doing for time? And I got more into writing and campaigning with the Christian Muslim Forum and thinking, reflecting and giving talks and campaigning for Christmas with Muslims, because there was some sensitivity in society about, oh no, you can't say Happy Christmas anymore because it's going to upset the Muslim community, and we couldn't find any evidence of that. And then, with some Muslim friends, including Yusuf al-Khoi, we took Christmas cards and Christmas greetings to the priests at St. Paul's Cathedral. And then, I think it was the same year, we took Eid greetings from the Christian churches to East London Mosque. And because we developed friendship and understanding, we were able to do those things together, and we were able to make new connections with people that we hadn't worked with or didn't especially know beforehand, who were significant in their own communities, not necessarily involved in interfaith, and bring them together. And I think that was very powerful for Christians to be wishing happy Eid Mubarak to the Muslim community. I left the Christian Muslim Forum in 2015. It wasn't Michael Gove, but we did run out of funding. But my interfaith journey and explorations continued after I left. I was no longer doing it as a day job, but it seemed to get deeper because I didn't have to observe those boundaries, and if I joined in the prayers, I wasn't going to get in trouble with anyone. Although sometimes I did, so few of us, I think I promoted it. I didn't necessarily have the idea. A few of us had the idea of Christians fasting for Muslims who couldn't fast during Ramadan. This was 2015, and there were some very keen, friendly, committed Christians, and also people of no faith, who committed to fast on behalf of Muslim friends. I think there was one woman who was an atheist or a humanist in America who fasted for the whole of Ramadan. And we collected all these days. I think we had about 78 days altogether. And so two selected friends who were unable to fast for health reasons, I sent them a certificate saying, your friends have fasted for you. However, one of my imam friends saw all this going on in social media and phoned me up and said, well, look, this is against the Sharia. You can't actually fast for someone else. You can only do your own fast. So I had to put a Sharia disclaimer on the bottom of the certificate. So it was quite friendly, his warning. But this is the kind of space that you can get into once you start going in really deeply and seeing how far you can go and how close we can get to each other and what we can do together. And then I discovered Sufism. As a lot of white Western people do, the route to Islam is often through Sufism. So I discovered the Threshold Society, which is a Mevlevi group. And my immediate point of contact was through a book that Chickpea Press produced, a children's storybook called The 99 Names. So it's got large fonts, very nice illustrations. It brings in reflections from outside the Islamic tradition, but connecting them all up with the names of God. And that was my entry into the Threshold Society. And I turned up it was in the church, St. Mark's Church in Islington, near Angel Tube Station, to meet with a group of Sufi Muslims and pray and do zikr together. And I was blown away. It had a really deep impact on me. Unlike anything before. And I hadn't had that experience in all the years I was doing interfaith properly, formally, professionally, which maybe tells you something. And then I moved to London, and every Friday, more or less, I would go to zikr, and then every Sunday morning, more or less, I would go to the parish church. And I was on both tracks for 2.5 years until the pandemic. And the pandemic interfered with everything. Everything went on to Zoom. And I thought, I can't do all this. But I had that deep experience of being in both religions, and I would tell people I'm religiously fluid. I am that dangerous hybrid that senior Christian people warned you about. And I think probably at this point, a lot of people thought I had converted to Islam, and I was thinking of doing it, and then it didn't work out. But that was when I started. Am I still okay for time? That was when I started writing how to read the Quran. So again, someone else got there first, but I didn't know that at the time. Mona Siddiqui wrote a book, Scottish Muslim professor of Islamic studies at Edinburgh. She wrote a very nice little book called How to Read the Quran. I'd recommend it. But my writing came out of the early experience of sitting with the imam and reading scripture together, of talking with friends, having all kinds of conversations and arguments with people on Twitter and Facebook about the scripture. So here's some excerpts. So it was directed against people who hated Muslims, hated Islam, hated the Quran, talked about it as a book of hate. And I said, I'm not a Muslim, I don't speak Arabic, although if I wanted to, I could go and find someone who could help me with the Arabic, and I could do that. I never actually did that. And this is my peaceful into faith, maybe slightly jumbled up reflection on the Quran. Surah 2, Al-Baqarah, or the Gospel of the Quran. I like to think of this surah as the Gospel of the Quran. It is very long, contains all the main themes. Yes, you'd be doing well and have a reasonable introduction if you just read this surah. And is making an appeal to the reader using, to Jews and Christians, familiar themes and characters from the Bible. This is what I was experiencing when I wrote it. I was thinking of it a few weeks ago when a friend in church was telling me that he found the Quran too difficult to read and that it was not like the Bible. I'd obviously prompted that conversation. I believe that this surah is seeking to win over the reader, just like the Gospels. It is probably unlikely that the reader will continue after this chapter if they have not been grabbed by it. I have heard from people in church, like my friend and others at interfaith gatherings, that not many even make it this far. Unfortunately, this includes Muslims too. It is well known that the Quran is a book that Daesh are not terribly familiar with. If they were, they would realize that it was telling them to stop. This is why I begin my exploration of Al-Baqarah with this selection of a dozen good things. I may not read them all out. This is the book in which there is no doubt, a guide for the righteous, those who believe in the unseen. Verse 2 and 3. Those who believe and those who are Jewish and the Christians and the Sabaeans, any who believe in God and the last day and act righteously, will have their reward with their Lord. They have nothing to fear, nor will they grieve. To every community is a direction towards which it turns. Therefore, race towards goodness wherever you may be. God will bring you all together. Verse 148. When my servants ask you about me, I am near. I answer the call of the caller when he calls on me. Verse 186. There shall be no compulsion in religion, even though the right way has become distinct from the wrong way. Verse 256. This is not a random collection of cherry-picked verses, as too many people have told me in the past, from a variety of positions, including fellow Christians and Muslims. They highlight the essence of Islam, inclusive of anyone who is aware of the ultimate, and especially of familiar religious traditions. Much of this surah is a dialogue, debate, or even argument with Muhammad's contemporaries, peace be upon him, and those who argued with Moses. There are parallel conversations taking place with an eye on how the other religious communities, Jews and Christians, engage with the message of revelation, the words of the Quran. I can imagine, with the benefits of my interfaith experience of recent years, sitting down with the early Muslims and sharing and reciting our sacred texts together and talking about God. I hope that this did happen some of the time, though then, as now, the concept of sharing diverse scriptures together would have been problematic for many people. I wrote a separate blog on each surah, each one dedicated to at least one Muslim friend. So you know I've got at least 120 Muslim friends that I'm dedicated to. In the meantime, I was continuing to reflect on lots of Christian theology, and I was finding that I was arguing with it a lot, and particularly with people who were taking things literally. Last year, I went to church on Good Friday, which is the day I'm commemorating the day when Jesus died, in Christian understanding, and then I was in church on Easter Sunday, celebrating the resurrection. Then I stopped going. And instantly, having been on 2 tracks and then just being on one, I tipped. And it was my now wife who was one of the influences that led to me taking the step to take my Shahada at the end of August. And I had various conversations with friends about converting and implications and so on. And one of my friends said, well, it's about time, isn't it? You've been sitting on the fence for years. And then there are all these other people who say, well, we thought you already had converted to Islam. We thought you were a Muslim. Or if any of you are, I know some of the people here are friends with me on Facebook, people saying, well, you were a Muslim, you just didn't know it, or you hadn't got to that point, and what's all the fuss about? And it's a fair point, I guess. I did surprise myself, having been fluid and having been all mixed and sitting on the fence, to actually make a decision and a commitment. And I felt much lighter afterwards. And it was an incredible experience seeing all those responses. So over 500 people liked or did a thumbs up. Well, a heart or a like on the Facebook status, which is the most engagement I've ever seen with anything. And typically it's taken me into places in both communities. So last weekend I was on Zoom at a church service telling Methodists and other Christians about my journey and taking questions from them. And thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that. We do have time for questions if anyone has any. Anyone please say? Any questions?
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much for a really lovely speech. I'm really sorry. I'm going to ask a really annoying question.
Go for it.
Which is slightly tangent. I want to ask you about Church of England.
Okay.
It's Church of England. It's. I am married to an Anglican, so the conversation comes up quite a lot. So it's probably not as. I find Church of England incredibly problematic on many, many different levels, and it's not Christianity, it's Church of England. So I want you to, if you can, to explain a little bit to an outsider how it works. And it has a lot of loyalty, so I'm not entirely certain that my husband would remain in the Church of England as it is now with this man that I don't even, Justin Welby, an oil man. I don't really know what he has in common with Jesus Christ, but anyway, that's, you know.
Okay.
So, but I want to know how it works that from Rowan Williams we get this horrible person, and I don't really know how else to express it. He is incredibly Islamophobic, but also how does it work in Christianity? Because I am so we've had this conversation, and I have asked specifically because we've decided that that our children are going to be Muslim, and I said that I have asked him to convert to a different type of Christianity because of, and I know it's really unfair because that wasn't the deal from the beginning. But I feel really uncomfortable with Church of England. I want you to tell us how it works, the structures a little bit, and how does one person get to decide in this authoritarian way and how to behave in this way. Like, for instance, his decision not to see the Palestinian brother, but also his tweets. So he's talking about Christians being attacked in Palestine, as if it matters whether people who are dying, if they are Christian or Muslim. I'm sorry, this is not a very nice question.
Go for it. Okay, so start with disclaimers. I work for the Methodist Church. I'm still working for the Methodist Church, having converted. I work in the mission team. It's interesting. I was a Methodist for 25 plus years. I worked with Rowan Williams because although the Christian Muslim initiative started with Archbishop Carey, it was soon handed over to Archbishop Rowan. And he's a good guy. He's poetic and Welsh and spiritual, and I obviously had professional dealings with him, and when I shared a bit about my story of Itikaf, I could see the impact it was having on him. And I shared my write-up of it with him in an envelope. I didn't show it to anyone else. Justin Welby is a very different character. What they have in common is that they are both patrons of the Christian Muslim Forum. So they're both leading figures in Christianity, in the Church of England, and in interfaith. And they have supported a lot of things. However, what tends to happen in the Church of England, and this is, I'm not an expert, is that you tend to get an alternation. So it seems to be, there's two archbishops in England, the Archbishop of York, Archbishop of Canterbury. One will be evangelical, and the other will be low church, liberal. So you may well get a change from a liberal person like Rowan Williams to someone much more evangelical, like Justin Welby. And Carey, that's right. Yes, Carey was evangelical. The Archbishop does not run the Church of England. He is senior, and the phrase in the Church of England is primus inter pares, which is Latin, which means first among equals. So he's also a bishop as well as an archbishop. So he doesn't manage the bishops, and he doesn't speak for the Church of England as the Church of England, so he's not like the Pope. So he speaks, some things he would check out through the appropriate channels, some things would be his own, and I haven't looked into why he would not, so he wouldn't be with the Reverend from Palestine because he'd been on the platform with Jeremy Corbyn. I don't know what Welby's issue is with Corbyn. And
Corbyn is a famous anti-Semite.
Right, well, I don't think so.
But I agree. But that's what he,
Right. So some of these things will be Justin Welby's own take for whatever reason, and I do know he has done good things. This is not a good example of this is not a good thing. But he has achieved reconciliation in some areas and addressed some conflict. But that's not terribly helpful in this situation. So he is not the Church of England. He is not the flavour of the whole Church of England. The Church of England has three different flavours: evangelical, liberal, and Catholic. So there's choices within the Church of England, and people follow their own path within it. But there are debates about whether you can, how you sit alongside the others, and it wasn't good to see that he would not meet with Reverend Isaac. That's not good at all. Well, the Church of England also described itself, I think, as a middle way, a bit like Islam, between the hardline Protestant and between the Catholic Church. So it has elements of both Protestant and Catholic, and the more Protestant people favour the Protestant end, and the more Catholic-leaning people favour the Catholic end, which is why some people can easily leave the Church of England and go into the Catholic Church.
Salam alaikum. Thank you for sharing your journey with us. I think I just missed it, or maybe it wasn't clear to me as to the why you converted. You know, you've kind of explained intersections in your life, but it wasn't clear to me the reasons. And if I may kind of add to that, because you quoted verse 128 in the Quran, Surah Baqarah, and I think it talks about to each nation or to each people we have given them their own way. And the main thing is to raise towards doing good. So why didn't you apply that to your own life? For example, you stick to your Christianity, pick and choose the bits that sit well with you. And why did you have to kind of come down, like with certainty, categorically, onto us and choose a side?
Okay, good question. Thank you. From almost from the beginning, I didn't stay on the Christian side of things. It's an interesting development to be so open, porous, inclusive, to really get in deep. And the Sufi practice made a massive impact. In a way which going to church and Christian spirituality and Christian religious practice wasn't there for me. I know it does exist in the Christian churches, particularly in some parts of the Church of England, the Catholic Church, which is not my tradition. And I found that I developed a practice through eventually learning to recite Al-Fatiha, using tasbih, reading the Quran every day, which I've been doing for 5 years or so. For all that until 2018, I was actually a church leader, and I was preaching, and I was responsible for some of the services and welcoming the ministers as they came in. That my direction and my heart was in the Islamic Sufi space, and it became my main identity. And I did make that choice to be fixed, but without giving up anything that was there, not rubbishing or criticizing where I was before, but bringing it all with me while making a firm stance in one faith and crossing over because of the impact it had on me. And I think I'd like to say the simplicity of the theology. So the theology is not giving me the same headache that I had previously.
Thank you, Julian. Two small questions. One is, I'm sure you have seen Musharraf Hussein's translation of the Quran, and what do you think about it? And the second one is about the non-English parts of the Church of England. Because that will be larger than the church, and their views on some issues are quite radically different from the church. How do they handle that?
Okay, Musharraf Hussain. So, what was it, 2014, late 2014, I went to see him in Nottingham just as I was about to leave the Christian Muslim Forum, so it was sort of last official opportunity to go there. We sat in the Karimiya Masjid in Nottingham, and he had his first rough translation of Surah Yusuf. He actually invited me to come and read Surah Yusuf with him in his draft English translation. I had my Bible with me. We compared the stories and we talked about the translation. So I was there at nearly the beginning of that journey, and I wrote some blurb for his translation, having read a little bit of it. he obviously gave me a copy, and I read through it all. And for most of the later blogs that I wrote on how to read the Quran, I took the text from his translation. And I also had some arguments with some people who were unhappy with his translation. It wasn't clear to me exactly why they were so unhappy, because I wasn't convinced that they were great Arabic scholars or anything, and that they'd really understood his choice of words for translation and what decisions and approaches you have to make when translating, because it's not just one word for one word. And unfortunately, people don't seem to know that. So if they don't see the word they're expecting, which they've got from English, in another translation, then they're really unhappy with it. Church of England. So I'm not an expert on the Church of England, but my understanding is that many churches in London are mostly non-white. Many different ethnic groups, lots of black churches, and in the Methodist Church we have significant numbers of Ghanaian, Zimbabwean and Nigerian Methodists in the British Methodist Church. They tend to have a more conservative theology, and my take on that is the legacy of British missionary activity, and that they haven't gone through the experiences that we've had in Britain, Europe, the West, with critical thinking, critical traditions, and they've not gone through that process. I don't know how or when or if they will, but they haven't. But they're engaging with these issues as well, and their thinking is happening. That may not have answered your question. Oh, so think about the Methodist Church specifically, because John Wesley had this famous saying, "The world is my parish." He thought he should be out there, and that his leaders and preachers should be out in the world, not just in England. So the Methodist Church in Britain set up the beginnings of the Methodist Church in America, and also in various African countries, in Asia. And there is a lot of global Methodism which traces its origins, obviously, to this country. And through my work in the Methodist Church, we would give funding to Methodist churches overseas, which were previously part of the British Methodist Church, but they're now all independent.
Thank you very much. We are going to end there. Salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad. Thank you very much for the talk, and hopefully you'll be around for a few minutes if people have any other questions. Just a couple of quick announcements. Next Friday we have a talk by Dr. Tahir Al-Faqih, who's speaking about the roving general and the scourge of the Janjaweed in Sudan. He'll be speaking about some of the challenges there. Fresh coming from advising the president of Sudan on the topic a couple of weeks ago. So hopefully it'll be really interesting and a good opportunity to find out more about what's going on there. Also a reminder that our Ramadan program will be starting on the 11th of March. And we do have a series of speakers every day, and the program will be shared. If you haven't already seen it, it's on sikkim.org.uk. Look forward to seeing you in our future programs. Salawat ala Muhammad wa al Muhammad.